Europe had lived for centuries under the shadow of wars, plagues, and fear. Cities were dark, the streets were silent, and death was everywhere. The church controlled the intellectual world of Europe, and people feared questioning it. But from this darkness, a new age would rise and change history forever. The Renaissance was born in Italy. Florence, Venice, and Genoa had become the centers of Mediterranean trade. Wealth arriving from the East was beginning to transform the Italian cities. And this wealth would begin the rebirth of Europe. In Florence, one family stood above the others. The Medici family had built immense wealth through banking. Artists, scientists, and thinkers were now supported by powerful families. And Florence was becoming the cultural heart of Europe. In 1453, Constantinople fell. Many Byzantine scholars began fleeing to Italy. They carried not only their belongings, but also the knowledge of the ancient world. And this knowledge would spark a great intellectual transformation in Europe. The people of the Renaissance were looking back to the past, especially to the worlds of ancient Rome and Greece. Ancient sculptures, architecture, and philosophy were being rediscovered. Europe was bringing the legacy of the ancient world back to life. And then, one of the greatest geniuses in history emerged. Leonardo da Vinci was not only a painter, he was also an inventor, engineer, and scientist. And his ideas would influence centuries to come. Renaissance scholars were trying to understand the human body. Muscles, bones, and organs were being studied in unprecedented detail. Knowledge was no longer coming only from ancient books, but from direct observation. And these studies would lay the foundation of modern science. The workshops of Italy were becoming the new centers of knowledge in Europe. Painters and artists had begun to recreate reality itself. Perspective, light, and human anatomy were transforming art forever. And art was becoming one of the greatest symbols of the Renaissance. The Renaissance was not only the rebirth of art, but also of science. People had begun to question the natural world. New ideas were spreading across Europe. And this transformation would lay the foundation of modern science. Scholars had begun to study the heavens. Stars and planets were being observed more closely than ever before. Some scholars began to believe the old ideas might be wrong. And the heavens were becoming humanity's new frontier of discovery. The Polish astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus introduced a revolutionary idea. Earth was not the center of the universe. Later, Galileo began observing the heavens through a telescope, and humanity's view of the universe began to change forever. But these new ideas had begun to threaten the Church. Scientists were now questioning the old order. And this questioning would spark a great conflict across Europe. But the spread of knowledge could no longer be stopped. And then an invention appeared that would change everything. The printing press changed the speed of knowledge forever. Books could now be reproduced in massive numbers. And ideas began spreading across all of Europe. The Renaissance had given people a new idea. The world could be explored. Europe was now sailing into the oceans. And the age of exploration was about to begin. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed westward. His goal was to reach India. But without realizing it, he had reached a new continent. And this discovery would change the fate of the world forever. European sailors were now reaching every corner of the world. Vasco da Gama had found the sea route to India, and Magellan's fleet would sail around the world. Europe was no longer just a continent, it was becoming a global power. The Renaissance was transforming not only ideas, but entire cities. Massive domes, marble columns, and grand structures were rising everywhere. Art and architecture had become the new symbols of power. And Europe was being reborn. The Renaissance had completely transformed Europe. Kings were growing stronger, and new states were rising. Science, education, and ideas were shaping Europe's future. And a new age had begun. Europe was no longer the old world. Science, art, and exploration were leading humanity into a new age. And the fate of the world was changing forever. Because the Renaissance was the birth of the modern world.